Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the battle raging in Westminster over whether or not Boris Johnson as Prime Minister intentionally misled MPs over the partygate scandal. Despite the lack of media focus, the investigation is still continuing. I get a lot of questions about it. It is still going on, and the stakes are still very high. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, as I've said before, the Privileges Committee investigation into Boris Johnson is really what numbered his days. Although Tory MPs eventually ousted him over the realisation that he'd knowingly appointed a sexual predator to a position which would be overseeing complaints of sexual harassment, they knew that the investigation was going to make him too hot to handle before long. And when the investigation was originally ordered by MPs, I didn't think we'd be here at the end of the year not really knowing much about how it was all proceeding. In fact, I would have imagined it would be done by now. The reason it isn't because it's been wound down on the quiet. That simply isn't possible. It's because Johnson is fighting it with every dirty trick he has in the Trumpian style of playing the victim to the deep state, or the Westminster elite as he would call it. We know that Johnson has engaged a top lawyer to defend his interests, Lord Panic KC, as well as others. We also know that he's used public money to pay for this very expensive legal representation. In fact, since stepping down, the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has permitted more public money to be used to keep funding Johnson's defence, even though it's got nothing to do with the work of government. This is effectively a private investigation against someone in the House of Commons. But Johnson is utterly desperate to sink the investigation. I must confess, I'm not quite sure why he insists on remaining MP. Does he still harbour a desire to become Prime Minister again? If so, why? He knows he can make a fortune as a former Prime Minister, and he can't imagine that he's going to further embellish his legend with another stint at the top. I know he's deluded, I know he's an egomaniac, but seriously. He's already in that happy place of being able to boast about a huge general election win, with a load of achievements where he can blame the consequence on the implementation of his successors. Why go back and preside over his work when it blows up? Also, why even hang around until the next election? Because if he loses his seat, the myth of the proven election winner is burst. He won't be able to blame the Tory leadership. He can blame Sunak for losing the election. He can say, well, if he wasn't an MP, he could say, well, I would have won it. But if he loses his own seat, that doesn't seem sensible. The pragmatic decision would be to step down, make loads of money, talking absolute tosh about how he would have won the next election if only his MPs had a bit of vision and a bit of backbone. But for whatever reason, Johnson is desperately clinging on to his seat in Parliament. And we know what his main legal defences are, because, very foolishly, he had his lawyer publish the first section. So he's tried two tactics so far to derail the investigation. The first is using the media to try and complain that procedures are not being applied fairly. This is a nonsense, of course. Apart from anything else, the committee has a majority of members from his own party. But it may explain why the investigation is proceeding very quietly at the moment. The members may not want to give Johnson the oxygen of publicity to air his witch hunt rants. The second tactic is to put the emphasis on whether or not Johnson knew he was lying when he was lying to MPs. But this is not the key point at all. In order for Johnson to be guilty, it's not actually necessary to prove that he knew he was misleading MPs while his mouth was flapping. The ministerial code requires any minister who discovers that they've misled the House to correct the record at the earliest opportunity. It's understood that ministers will have to discuss complex matters with MPs, but that those same ministers are often very, very inexperts, to put it politely, in the matters that they're discussing. So unlike in a select committee hearing where you've got your officials, and if you get asked a question you're not sure the answer, you just lean into one of your officials and they whisper an answer to you. That doesn't happen at the dispatch box. You're on your own. So sometimes a clever question from another MP can draw a response which turns out to be untrue from the minister. But they may not be deliberately lying. They may just be talking beyond what has been discussed with their expert official. So they're just extrapolating and getting it wrong. So what happens is you go back later on to your department, your officials go, Minister, I think you find you just lied to Parliament there. The minister then goes, oops, and arranges to go back to the House the next sitting day and correct the record. All very embarrassing, but no foul because the original error was inadvertent and the minister took all reasonable steps to correct it. The world moves on. But going back to Johnson, if the committee finds a record that officials told him that something he said to MPs was incorrect, but it was weeks later before Johnson finally came to Parliament and corrected the record, usually after an expose in the media, he is still guilty. This is because even if he says that he thought he was telling the truth at the time of the original statement, there will be dates between being told by his officials that he was wrong and actually telling MPs. Now, if that's like a day or two, that's fine. If it's weeks or even a couple of months, then in that period of time, he was allowing Parliament to be misled, deliberately allowing them to be misled because he knew the truth, but MPs didn't. So what may have originally been inadvertent becomes deliberate. And that's a breach of the code, just as much as if he deliberately lied right from the start. This is what's probably going to sink him. It may be extremely difficult to prove that Johnson knew he was lying at the time he made the statements, because to prove that, you'd have to find a record of him discussing the lie in advance with officials. I strongly suspect no such record exists. But it is likely that there are records, and that the committee have records, of officials discussing the statements that would prove that Johnson failed to correct the record for some considerable time. And the fact that Johnson's lawyer has tried to shift the emphasis onto the original statement with this issue of intent suggests that Johnson himself thinks there is probably proof that he didn't correct the record as quickly as he should have. So the game for Johnson may well be as follows. So the committee concludes its investigation. I've no idea when at this point, because there's no public running commentary for the procedure at the moment, which I thought there would be. They announced that there's no evidence that Johnson deliberately misled the House with the statement, but there is proof that he was told of the errors and then didn't correct the record for some time after. Johnson will then probably try to play to the public gallery and claim that the committee found him not guilty of lying, only in being tardy with the correction. So why are they still punishing him? There was no intent. There was no intent. It's all a witch hunt, he'll say. They're hanging him for a technicality, he'll say. Of course, the public have no direct say in the matter. He needs Tory MPs to vote against whatever decision the committee draws, or at least the punishment. In order to persuade them to do that, he'll need public opinion to swing to his side. The reason Tory MPs didn't vote against the investigation in the first place, because that would have been the tidiest way to sink it, was because they would have suffered at the hands of their own voters for letting off another crooked Tory. One rule for them, another for the rest of us and all that. Johnson needs to convince them that there will be no such public backlash. But to do that, he needs to persuade the public that whatever conclusion is drawn is not really a guilty verdict and that MPs are just acting out of spite. He's going to play on this intent defence. Now, it's not remotely true. The committee have listened to opinions from some real heavyweight legal experts on the process. They are taking their time to get everything right so that there can't be any reasonable objections to how the investigation is being conducted. As a result, Boris Johnson, he's already benefiting from enormous privilege, if you think about it. The Privileges Committee exists for cases like this. This is a particularly high-profile one, but it's what they do. The idea that they're now proceeding as if all of this was new, uncharted territory, as if it was a brand new court being set up, is a reflection of just how much trouble Johnson can still cause to the reputation of Parliament if they give his lawyers or his MPs any landing zone at all to let him off. As far as I can tell from legal musings, a recent one I'll post in the description below, but it's arguing for publication of Johnson's latest legal challenge. But the main argument seems to be not about whether Johnson misled the House or not. He did. Everyone knows it. To coin a phrase from Blackadder, he is as guilty as a puppy sat beside a pile of poo. It is about whether intent at the time is necessary to be proven. Now, Johnson's lawyers are arguing that intent must be proven for it to be contempt. All the other lawyers are pointing that it doesn't. Basically, I've read pieces on this investigation from a wide range of legal and constitutional experts. The only people that I have seen trying to argue that intent at the time has to be proven are those who are being paid by Boris Johnson to say so. But this is essentially a game for public opinion, not legal fact. The legal facts are clear. Johnson wants the public to think he has been the result of a political witch hunt so that he can persuade his MPs to vote against whatever the committee recommends, safe in the knowledge they won't suffer at the ballot box. Obviously, he'd prefer to trap the committee into letting him off entirely, hence using goodness knows how much of our taxes to pay for the best legal bulldog he could find. But for those Tory MPs who would love to let him off and avoid the scandal, they do need to be mindful that the public are not impressed with letting your mates off. It's why Partygate cut so deeply in the first place. And remember, before Partygate, the Owen Paterson scandal was just such a case. Boris Johnson forced his MPs to vote to basically disband the Standards Committee, of which the Privileges Committee is a part, in order to get his mate off. The public backlash was fierce. And the public already think Boris Johnson lied to MPs. Remember what's at the core of this, if you've forgotten. Staff at Downing Street were eating party food and drinking alcohol and listening to music on a regular basis. Johnson's defence hinges on the notion that he's had to admit that he witnessed this behaviour. He saw people eating buffet food, drinking alcohol, listening to music, socialising basically. Despite witnessing this behaviour, his defence hinges on the notion that when he watched it, when he observed these proceedings, he didn't recognise it as a party. He didn't think that constituted a party. Not much of the public believe that. So if MPs vote to say that they think the committee's wrong and cancel the punishment, the voters will think, oh, he's clearly guilty, and they will punish those MPs as being crooked at the ballot box. So for those wondering what's happening with the investigation, it is still going on. It's not been wound down. It's going to carry on. But the committee is just being incredibly careful, as far as I can tell, about the procedures and what they let out into the public in order to avoid any room for an attack on the way they're managing it. Because ultimately, Johnson's defence is going to be that he is the target of a witch hunt. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.